Well, hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Williams, Senior Editor at MGMA and host of the MGMA Podcast Network. We are back for another MGMA Business Solutions Podcast. And I'm excited to say we have Dr. Tom Schwieterman joining us today as a guest. Dr. Tom is the Chief Medical Officer for Midmark Corporation, and he has extensive experience as a private practice physician in a rural community. He also, now I have to go through some of these notes here. He has a background in software engineering, medicine, and business administration, and he leads Midmark's focus on innovative technology that can enhance experiences between the caregiver and the patient. And today we have a special topic we're going to be talking about. We'll be discussing the critical importance of accurate and consistent blood pressure measurement and how it impacts patient outcomes. Dr. Tom, welcome to the show.
Excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Daniel.
Yeah, really good to get to have you on here. I've been trading emails with you and your team for a while, and we've got you here, so it's so cool to have you here. So I want to start. I was given a lot about your background, but I'd love to hear it in your own words. What would you like to share, either some career highlights or anything else that got you interested in healthcare in the first place? Because you do have that really varied background.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I certainly did not take the traditional path through medical school. I started out as a kid really falling in love with software engineering and programming. I was one of those guys in the bedroom spending hours on an Apple II computer, and always kind of thought I wanted to be a doctor, but knew that this computer science piece was a part I couldn't let go. So I majored in software engineering undergrad, and I found my way to medical school after kind of perusing through a very difficult coursework between computers and biology type sciences. I was intending actually to go into the innovation space right through after medical school into something more around the innovation side of things, but I kind of accidentally fell in love with patient care, which I didn't expect. So I ended up spending the first 11 years of my career practicing medicine in a small town, delivering babies, going to the hospital, doing rounds. And it was kind of interesting. So after those 10 years, my love affair for the software innovative side of me sort of kicked back in. And I said, I kind of want to go back to where I started, which is around solving complex problems. My major is actually systems analysis, which is a study of complex systems and how to make them more efficient and effective using technology. And I can't think of a more appropriate market than medicine for that complexity. So anyway, I call myself the accidental doc because I sort of walked into medical school in a different path, but I'm super excited to be here, and Midmark gives me a great platform to work on what I love to do.
That's incredible. Now, as I said, we're going to get deep into blood pressure measurement and talking about that. But first, because you do have this really unique background, I have to admit, I think you're the first person that kind of came in from that computer programming, computer analysis side of it. How do you use that side of it in your work now? Is there any correlation at all?
It's a beautiful question, Daniel. I've not been asked that by many people, and I'd love to talk about it. Really, if you think about what medicine is, it's taking like all kinds of data that's bringing into your brain, and you're kind of sorting it out. And what's going on with this patient? What do I need to do to make sure I'm making the right decisions? And that sort of compilation of inputs and outputs and deciding kind of what the best path is not all that different from what you do in a medical innovation space from a vendor standpoint. The beauty that I love to talk about is that knowing the clinical sciences behind it, sort of what the body's trying to do and why it's doing it, and combining it with sort of a device perspective on the software and hardware side, you get this triangulation that's really powerful. And you mentioned my MBA, and part of my about 7 years into my practice of being here at Midmark, I began to realize that I'm missing this last language, which is the business language. So I went and got an MBA. And so I use all three of them in some of these innovative concepts is what do we need to do at the point of care for accuracy and sort of clinical performance? What is the device and software side, and how can that contribute? And what are the business rationale behind why a health system or physician might want to do this? So I kind of built my acumen around those three pillars. And it's really fun to see which language I should use if I'm talking to an engineer, which language I should use if we're talking to the CFO. So it's been a good run.
I love that. So a lot of our listeners may be well versed in who Midmark is, but before we take this deeper dive into blood pressure and the work y'all are doing there, just tell us a little bit about who Midmark is.
Yeah, we're an interesting company. We're in all three healthcare markets. We're in animal health, which is veterinary medicine. We're in dental care. But the largest part of our business is where we're focused on here is the medical side. We do everything in that exam space that you would need to have an effective patient care encounter, whether it's the equipment that the patient or you sit on, whether it's the cabinetry around it, the devices. We found over the years that supplying the equipment was just a small piece of what we do. Describing how that equipment is effective and how we can make your operations more efficient. So we bundled up an enormous amount of intellectual property around what works and what doesn't work, who's doing it well. If someone in the Pacific Northwest is doing it really well, we bring that to the East Coast as well. And so really Midmark is really a augmentary force to the health systems and the listeners of this podcast. For you got an operational need, you got staffing shortages. What can we do in our equipment and ecosystem setup to make you more effective and allow you to hit your key performance measures? So it kind of dovetails a little bit into blood pressure as I think we're going next, which is that's a critical KPI for all the people in this podcast. I'm certain of it.
It is, and that's what I was going to say as well. If we put ourselves in the patient's shoes, if we go to a doctor, we're going to get our blood pressure taken more likely than not. You know, that is one of the things that we know. We might fill out some information, go into the...
Well, let me add to that.
Yeah.
I practiced for 10 years, and the typical time for a blood pressure issue, I don't know, mid-late 40s, maybe early 50s is where the body starts to lose its warranty period, if you will.
Okay.
And so many of those men who would come in at that age had never been on a medicine in their whole life. Wow, it's their wives who are saying, hey, honey, we need some life insurance, or you need to get yourself checked out.
Right.
And they would come into my office, and sure enough, their blood pressure would be 147 over 92. I say, okay, boy, you're kind of in that range. You need to do something about it. So blood pressure is not only a fundamental need in the understanding of a patient's health and wellness, it often is the first medicine, the first diagnosis a patient receives. And it's one that's called the silent killer, so people don't feel any different. You know, what do you mean, doc, my blood pressure's up? I'm great. I golfed 18 holes. I did one short of breath. So there's a bit of a different stake in the ground when it comes to hypertension. It sort of brings awareness to people that they're not 18 anymore. So getting it right is so important, because when you're entering a patient into a therapeutic plan that they've never had to go through before, that first pass has to be the right pass.
Yeah. Yeah, I am so glad you mentioned that and shared that information about it. And at Midmark, y'all have put together a white paper on blood pressure and how that can correlate to outcomes for patients. So talk about that. What was the genesis of the paper, and what are some things that maybe surprised you about it?
Fascinating story. We have always developed, state-of-the-art patient positioning equipment, and we're always in the mindset of it being used for procedures. If you needed to do a female exam or need to do a procedure on a small dermatologic case of some sort. But we never really saw our patient positioning as being important for blood pressure. And what happened in 2017, we always review the literature, and we reviewed the SPRINT study in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the most pivotal study, I think, in my career on how you manage a patient's blood pressure. And it determined that not just the what you treat the number to is important, but how you attain the number is important. So we looked at our portfolio and realized that everything we're doing in our exam tables with the patient arm positioning and the feet flat on the floor suddenly became highly relevant to taking an accurate blood pressure. So we saw the new guidelines come out a year or two later from the American Heart Association. We looked at those, and sure enough, they followed that same study from the New England Journal. And I was looking through, my scientific mind kicked in, and I said, where has this been studied? Who has proven that this matters? Because they had 7 steps you had to follow. They typically cost a little more time for the patients and the caregivers. And so we determined in that investigation that it's sort of our responsibility that if we're selling this solution as a blood pressure optimization tool, there needs to be some proof behind it.
Right.
And there wasn't. And so we commissioned a study, and we actually went out, found a clinical research organization. We networked with the Ohio State University. I found the statistician that's typically used by the American Heart Association so that he knew the protocol and how to compile the statistical analysis. And then the hardest part of my career was I had to keep my sticky fingers off of it because I'm a manufacturer's employee. I have a vested interest in the outcome because, of course, I wanted to see that it made a difference. And I'll never forget the moment that those results showed up. I was in a director's meeting amongst a bunch of my peers, probably 30 of them, and I look at my email, and there's an email from the statistician who was doing our study. And I had no idea what the results were going to be because I was very purposeful in staying to my Hippocratic oath of staying out of it.
Yeah.
And he accidentally sent them to me. And so I opened them up in the middle of this meeting, and I was looking at these numbers, and I almost jumped out of my chair because the numbers were very significant. So what we found in those numbers is that if you do the right steps and you do them the way the American Heart Association recommends, your blood pressure on average will be 7 points lower on the systolic, the top number, 4.5 points lower on the bottom number. Now that is a leap for a physician's diagnostic criteria, because what we also discovered is if that is the case, your numbers are 7 or 4.5 too high, there's probably 30 to 40 million people in this country who are misclassified as hypertensive. So we're not talking a little nuanced kind of esoteric result. This is something that impacts, 1 in 10 Americans as a diagnosed patient with hypertension as perhaps being on the wrong medication, of having the wrong diagnostic label. So we knew it was significant. And I'm very proud of the fact that Midmark was able to sort of advance the clinical sciences around blood pressure, and very happy to see that our solutions are part of the solution.
Okay. You identified some of those, I guess, origins or starting points for error there. How do you standardize it? What do you do to go about getting the standardization of blood pressure measurement?
Well, I'll start with one of the myths that I see a lot out there. Okay. The myth that I see more often than anything else is people think your blood pressure is a static number. They think it's like I'm typically 130 over 80, and that's when if I get my blood pressure, it's going to stay there. What reality is that it's extremely dynamic. If I were to put you on a treadmill and have you run for 15 minutes, your no doubt blood pressure is going to go up 5 or 10 points, and your pulse is going to go up. So people don't realize how dynamic the blood pressure is from one moment to another. On top of that, people don't understand that the actual studies around whether blood pressure matters are all done on something called resting blood pressure. So resting blood pressure is, what is your blood pressure when you're doing nothing? You're just sitting quietly and you're in a restful state, because that's the pressure your body gets all the time. And all the clinical studies use that as sort of the benchmark for what a blood pressure measurement, what blood pressure care should be. So the standards part, where your question was leading on, all the standards for controlling blood pressure effectively are based on resting blood pressure. So our study that we mentioned before was, how do you get the best resting blood pressure possible? What do you need to do to make sure that when the data is coming into the doctor's decision making, it's the right data that can be actionable, and he can actually make the right call on you. If you're that 45-year-old guy that's got sent in by his wife, and I'm committing you to a pill every day for the first time in your life, I got to get it right. Mm-hmm. So the standard that we are really, really intent on focusing our solutions on is around that resting blood pressure.
Okay. Now, so I was looking over the paper you've developed at Midmark, the Better BP initiative. Is that what we're getting at here? Tell us about what that initiative is, what's in it.
We're kind of creating a new swim lane as a vendor, and I'll try to explain it to you. The swim lane being, what's our responsibility for patient care? And we've determined that there's a bit of a gap in industry. There are certain companies that do the latest and greatest sciences around new medical devices like implants and things like that. There are other companies that do really good data like electronic health records. Our swim lane is kind of between those two. We want to create an environment where you're going to get the right results the first time in the most efficient way possible. So we came up with this concept called Better BP, and Better BP has 3 main pillars to it. The first one is, make sure you're using the right equipment, the right technology get the blood pressure in the first place. It has to be FDA cleared. It has to be accurate. It has to be a trusted, proven solution. That's pillar one. The next one is make sure you're doing the test right, the correct way, the procedure. And in most cases for blood pressure, it's positioning. So the middle column is the positioning column. Make sure you're positioning the patient properly. And that's where our correct BP clinical study demonstrated it makes a big difference. The last pillar is the data connectivity piece. If you're getting a number and you know it's done properly, let's get it to the clinical record in the best way possible so there's no errors in the transmission of that. So those are the three pillars. And we have now, with this study and with our work, put the best case forward for technology in our vital solution, the best case forward for positioning, and finally, we connect to the EMR in a fairly robust way to make sure there's no errors.
Okay.
So that's better BP.
Okay. Well, you have this computer science, computer analysis, technology background, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to totally geek out on the tech. So
right.
How is Midmark utilizing tech to make sure these levers are being used, so to speak, the different tools are being used, that there is this consistency across the board?
I've probably made 5 trips to California where our device group lives, and I am constantly out there with human subjects, testing our device accuracy, and doing the actual clinical studies of doing a manual blood pressure with my own ears, checking the device, and all very hands-on. The clinical team is extremely hands-on to make sure that what we put in the marketplace meets the needs of the customer. I consider myself an ambassador to the clinical community, that I think of myself as a physician first and as a Midmark executive second. And that sounds nuanced, but it's really important.
Right.
And I hold that Hippocratic oath very, very importantly, because if I agree to something at the top level of the clinical team, it goes through the organization. So I take that very seriously. So by hands-on testing, I know the machine intimately. The second layer of that is I own the validation protocol. So if there is a device that gets created, the engineers don't get to choose who tests it. The sales team doesn't get to see who tests it. I choose who tests it. And I personally fly to the validation site. I meet the nurses or the test agents to make sure they're doing it properly. So on the geek out side, I'm also deeply involved in the algorithm side. I spent an hour with the statistical analytics of our performance of the last week. And that's where the inner nerd in me gets really fired up, because I get to see exactly what's going on. And so that when I look a chief medical officer of a health system in the eyes, I know our systems are doing what we say they're going to do.
Yeah.
Very, very critical part of my role. I take it very seriously.
Yeah. So Dr. Tom, you had the opportunity to geek out on technology, but you said something earlier that really caught my interest. You said it's vital as well to have proper patient positioning in these blood pressure tests. So talk about that. Why is the positioning so important, and what are some of the factors there that are important as well?
That's a great question. In fact, that was one of the more interesting parts of the New England Journal study that I mentioned earlier, that for the first time that I saw in my clinical life, the how you take a blood pressure was just as important as the outcome of the blood pressure number itself. And so what the American Heart Association and the SPRINT study determined is that there are 7 critical factors to taking a blood pressure properly. Many of those are most of them actually are positioning. You have to have your feet flat on the floor. You have to have your back supported, so there's no stress on the musculoskeletal system. You want your arm supported so that you're not exerting exercise and motion on your arm from a muscle standpoint. The cuff has to be in the right position, exactly at the heart height. And these are very important. In fact, our Correct BP study kind of focused on that. And what we determined is that by following those correctly, the resting blood pressure will get to a more appropriate level of 7 points lower systolic and 4.5. So positioning is from my standpoint, more critical than I thought it was going into the study.
Okay. Couple more questions before we sign off. So one of these is the integration of the EMR, because at the end of the day, it sounds like what you guys are doing, one, you want to get it accurate. 2, you want to help these providers have efficient workflows. So how do you integrate that EMR in there to make that work for all parties?
Interesting story. We updated our ECG software, which has nothing to do with blood pressure necessarily, but in the update, there was one more click. The cardiologist had to click a certain button that they didn't have to click before, and they were upset about this single click. And so I actually went on site, talked to the cardiologist. So I learned in that experience that workflow is king, is that we can't do anything to delay or extend some procedural element of the patient visit. So we are extremely careful whenever we put something in the marketplace that is 0 clicks if possible, and our blood pressure is really close, if not there. On top of that, when we do the workflow, we understand that waiting 5 minutes for a blood pressure and doing it 3 times, that's more than they've done before, where they typically sit you on the table and do the arm. So we're constantly looking for ways that we can cut waste out of the system, where the clinical performance can get you the correct answer in a shorter amount of time and fewer steps. And that's some of the work we're doing right now on the clinical team, is saying, what can we do with this protocol to take steps out? As an example, in the Correct BP study, there's a 5-minute waiting period before you get a blood pressure. What's not in the study is that if you do the blood pressure immediately in the right positioning, you already get 4 points of systolic and almost 2.5 on diastolic improvement. Okay. So you could say to a customer, look, if you don't want to wait the 5 minutes, you don't have time, at least position them correctly. You'll get half of the way there. So we know, especially your audience at MGMA, time is money, and staff is already overburdened. They can't afford to do anything more than they absolutely have to at that point of care. So our context on that is to really try to be the vendor that kind of takes a click or 2 away. I know it's a wordy answer, but it's just so important.
No, I love that. I love that. So for the last question then, just looking ahead, because you do have your feet in so many different areas of having that, being a physician, having that computer background, the tech background, some of that engineering bleeding into it, and the MBA side of it. What are you excited about from a technological or innovative standpoint about what's happening as we look forward?
We have a board meeting in 6 weeks, and one of the things we do in the September board meeting is we present the long-range vision of the company, where things are going. And what really excites me about that, Dan, is this, with the value-based medicine pieces coming on board and the incentives around good cost optimization and clinical workflows and clinical outcomes, we have a real interesting role to play in that, meaning that, look, if you're trying to lower your costs and improve your clinical outcomes and you're incentivized it from your dollars of your reimbursement, we think we got lots of avenues to play in that, whether it's infection prevention, whether it's blood pressure optimization, whether it's being better at the ECG diagnostics. So we're getting closer and closer to the customers and Midmark being completely aligned on vision and needs. We're not selling you a bag of goods. We're trying to establish a partnership to where we talk to these clinical administrators and say, what's burdening you? What workflow scenario is driving you crazy? How can we kind of bring a piece of that and own a piece of that and take it away? For instance, we're looking at AI and large language models. We're looking at all kinds of ways that our ecosystems can allow you to do more with less, because as we know in the clinical and ambulatory sites, staff is really, really tough to come by these days. So I'm super excited that we are increasingly a part of the solution and not so much just a vendor of products.
All right. Well, Dr. Tom, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the MGMA Business Solutions Podcast.
It's been a pleasure, and let's hope we can do it again.
I would love that. All right. Well, that is going to do it for this episode, everyone. As we always do, I'm going to put some direct links in the episode show notes so you can click right through to a lot of these solutions that Dr. Tom has been talking about. And I want to thank Dr. Tom. He is, let me just remind everybody, he's the Chief Medical Officer at Midmark. And we're going to have a direct link to Midmark as well in the episode show notes. So until then, thank all of you for being MGMA podcast listeners.